こんにちは、ゆうこ先生です。Today in this lesson, let's explore another habit of Japanese speakers that often surprises learners. The tendency to drop particles like wa, ga, or ni in everyday conversation. This is the second video in a mini-series about real spoken Japanese. If you haven't seen the first lesson, I introduced a habit of leaving sentences unfinished. You can find a link to the lesson in the description. Okay, let's begin today's lesson. では始めましょう。The particles wa, ga, or ni are often dropped in everyday conversation. When it comes to these two, wa and ni, this tendency applies only to their specific functions. Wa as a topic marker and ni as a destination marker. Other functions of wa and ni are not typically dropped, so please be careful. It is also important to remember this. This is only a tendency, not a strict grammatical rule. It's perfectly fine to use these particles in your speech. In fact, for beginners, using these particles helps your meaning come through accurately. I'm sharing this information so you understand why these particles are sometimes absent when native speakers talk. Being aware of this tendency will help you understand Japanese speakers better and improve your natural speech as you progress in your learning journey. Okay, from here, let's look at examples of how these particles can be dropped. The first one is the topic marker wa. Here are the four sentences. このケーキは美味しいです。お仕事は何ですか？スペイン語はわかりません。The particle in the first two sentences is a topic marker. So you can drop them and go like this. このケーキ美味しいです。お仕事何ですか？ However, this wa is not a topic marker. It's a contrast marker highlighting the Spanish language that you don't understand in contrast to other languages that you do understand. Since this particle wa is not a topic marker, it cannot be dropped. You must keep it there to preserve the existing contrast in the context and go like this. スペイン語はわかりません。The next particle that is often dropped in conversation is ga. Here are the example sentences. この辺にトイレがありますか？ラーメンが大好きです。誰がオーナーですか？ The particle ga tends to get dropped regardless of the function. So in everyday conversation, you will most likely hear these versions. この辺にトイレありますか？ラーメン大好きです。But please remember that the particle ga cannot be dropped when it's attached to a question word. In the third sentence, ga is attached to the question word who, 誰. So you must keep it and go like this. 誰がオーナーですか？ The next one is the particle o. Here are the example sentences. 猫と犬を飼ってます。ランチを食べましたか？先生のメアドを知ってますか？ Out of the four particles, the particle o is the one that most Japanese speakers drop in everyday conversation. This is likely because the direct object can be easily identified from the context without a marker. So in spoken Japanese, you will often hear these versions. 猫と犬飼ってます。ランチ食べましたか？先生のメアド知ってますか？ The final particle that tends to get dropped in conversation is the destination marker に。Here are the example sentences. 明日のパーティーに行きますか？この辺にトイレがありますか？ 8 時に電話してください。Out of these three sentences, this particle に is the destination marker, so it will get dropped like this. 明日のパーティー行きますか？ However, these two are not destination markers. The particle に in the second sentence indicates a place of existence, and the third one indicates a time expression. Therefore, we typically keep these particles in our speech. On the side note, this particle will be dropped as we discussed earlier, so these versions are most natural in conversation. この辺にトイレありますか？ 8 時に電話してください。So this is the second habit among native speakers. The particles は、が、お、に are often dropped in conversation. Mastering when to drop these particles takes time, and as I said earlier, it is completely fine to use them in your speech. For now, you can simply keep this information in mind as it naturally reflects how native Japanese sounds. In the next video, we will look at another habit that also surprises learners. Why Japanese questions sometimes don't include a question particle か. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. And if the next lesson is already available when you are watching this, you will find the link in the description. ではまた次のレッスンで会いましょう。